former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode, Vinegar and Honey, with Cameron Cowan.
Good evening, everyone. This is Wade Franson. I'm your host for tonight's show, Vinegar and Honey, with Cameron Cowan. We've had a little bit of a change of plans for the opening segment. Normally, we'll explore deeply the history and biography of our guest to get to know them. But a couple of things have happened. First, we've had Cameron on the show before, and some of you know him. We look forward to having him. He's in the studio. We'll have him on in just a few minutes. But the other thing that happened is I had I suffered a loss this past week since last week's show. And that loss is the passing of my sister, Kobina Laomi Franson, affectionately known by everybody as Kobe. And so I wanted to take this opportunity in the opening segment to do a bit of honor for my sister in an homage, a sharing. And part of the reason for that is that I have been having a lot of emotions, frankly, that I've either never experienced before or had so deeply buried that I wasn't aware of them. Now, some of you know that my own work as an author is in the form of an autobiographical trilogy. The first book in this trilogy is The People of the Sign. And here's a little flyer from the book launch. The People of the Sign was published in 2012. And its publication was both the conclusion of a major journey and the start of a new journey. What I'd like to do right now is, by way of introduction to this opening segment, read the preface from my book, which is just over a page, because it really speaks to the background of what I'm doing on this opening segment and why I want to talk a little bit about my sister. Dear reader, writing a deeply personal story is difficult and painful. And again, my trilogy is autobiographical. It navigates the journey of my life. This first book is one of the major chapters of it, coming of age story. And you know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and play the book trailer for the video and let everybody know that I also plan to give away a copy of this to those who comment in the chat, because I think the book trailer gives very quickly a little bit of the backdrop of the story that will be helpful before I read the preface. So here it is.
What do divorce, kidnapping, ancient prophecies, and the collapse of the Soviet Union have in common with the music of the Beatles? These are all elements of author Wade Franson's traumatic autobiographical journey, recorded in his best-selling book, The People of the Sign. He effortlessly weaves these elements together, proving once and for all that truth really is far, far stranger than fiction. Order your copy now on Amazon or by emailing orders@soupllc.com.
So in that book, I explain how the divorce part of that was the divorce of my parents, which happened when I was about 8. My father being from Sweden, my mother being British, of British heritage, born in Canada, and I was born in Canada, where I lived for a couple of years before they moved to the US. When that marriage fell apart in divorce, my mother was awarded full custody. And of course, that was many years ago. I don't look that young anymore, but I'm actually older than I look. So many years ago, when it was very common to award custody to the woman, kind of regardless of the situation. And sorry, I'm just making sure that Taz knows. Just email info@soupllc.com, because we want to get you your 2 books, which are coming to you. And just do it again. Email them and give them your address so we can take care of that and get you your books. So when that custody was awarded, my dad came up with a plan, talked to attorneys, found out that as a Swedish citizen, there was a chance that if he could get the kids to Sweden, he could get the courts there to award him custody. So he told the babysitter that he was taking me and my 2 sisters, my older sister Kobe, who just passed away, and my younger sister, whose name I can't mention per her request. Told the babysitter he was taking us to the mall. He just didn't tell her the mall was in Sweden. Long story, fully explained in the book as to how he managed to smuggle us out of the country, managed to get us into Sweden, despite the passports not even being fully in order. And indeed, the Swedish courts did award him custody. But in order to pay for the court case, he split the 3 of us up with 3 sets of aunts and uncles. So that's the divorce and the kidnapping part of the story. And that's why I became separated from both my sisters and both my parents for 2 years in Sweden. And of course, those early experiences formed and shaped me in a number of ways, which I now view as positive, but trust me, it was hell at the time. When this worked its way up to the court system, the courts then, after 2 years, told my dad that he would have to move back and live with us in Sweden if he wanted to retain custody. So he did. But in doing so, he had to pull my older sister away from an aunt and uncle who themselves had no children. And they were very attached to Kobe, as was she to them. And she hated this. She hated being brought back to live with her dad, because all of us at some level blamed my dad for this. For what? Well, for being torn away from mom, for having our family destroyed. And Kobe had landed in a place with 2 aunts and uncles who loved her dearly. Now, I was with cousins, which had its pros and cons. My younger sister, was in a different family where there was a lot of rivalry between her and the daughter of her age. In any case, we were now all 3 together, but my dad had gotten involved in this religious group that most would consider a cult. This is why the people of the sign was one of the markers, the prophetic markers of why that group believed that it was super special. By the time this worked its way to the Supreme Court of Sweden, my mother had remarried and appeared before the court, showing the court how the children would have a 2-parent family if they returned to her. And my father had gotten to the point where he believed that women had a subordinate role to men, per, husband is the head of the wife, kind of traditional paternalistic theology. And he felt God had his back and would guide him, protect him, grant him the victory. So he felt that it was okay to sort of tell this woman judge she had no business being a judge as a woman. Now, remember, this is Sweden, right? Liberal, progressive Sweden. And so it was not a hard choice for the judge to award the custody to mom, who was there with her husband. Of course, what she didn't reveal to the courts was that this was a guy she'd met in a bar, and it was a sham marriage designed to win the custody, because my mom was an alcoholic, which is why my dad had done this in the first place. And so on the flight back home, my mother was so drunk on the plane, she couldn't make it down the tarmac, down the ladder to the tarmac for the waiting crowds, family, newspapers celebrating the mother bear who had gotten her bear cubs back. Couldn't walk down the steps without aid, was belligerent. And then over the next few months, we had to sit for newspaper articles writing this wonderful story about how Mother Bear had won her cubs back. But this so-called husband was long gone after the first week, and my mother was descending into a completely uncontrolled alcoholism. This led to worse situations, and my older sister, Kobe, ran away at age 13, leaving her 12-year-old brother, me, and my little sister with the alcoholic mother. She was the one trying to hold it together. And she ended up being able to settle with friends and family up in Canada, where we were born. And of course, I was always somewhat jealous that she had escaped. Now, usually I say that that's when the story gets weird, because now religion gets all mixed up into it. And to this day, that's why I'm still a seeker looking for the deep answers to questions. I've gotten the answers along the way, and they help me, but the answers keep going, the questions keep coming, and the answers keep going deeper, and that's the point of this show. And we'll continue to explore and invite people to share their perspectives, because human experience is so diverse and so rich. But back to my sister and honoring her. My sister was born on June 1st. And I was born on June 2nd. So the sibling rivalry in our case was related to the fact that she was trying to be the glue to hold the family together. And I resented this. And that framed and shaped our early relationship, which was of course, damaged by this splitting and this ripping and tearing apart of the family. And so this book that I wrote was therapeutic to work through a lot of that. And now I'll go ahead and read that preface and wrap this up with some comments about my sister and the loss that I'm feeling, and try to explain what it is that I'm feeling now, 10 years after I finished writing the third book in this trilogy. The second book's called The Hardness of the Heart. The third book's called The Rod of Iron. Dear reader, writing a deeply personal story is difficult and painful. It's just plain hard to approach life objectively or to understand your own motives. Is it narcissistic to imagine that an autobiographical review of your personal experience is of interest? And if a far better writer than I, Rousseau, put his life to the test of truth in Confessions, and his reviewer skewered him for failing that test, those familiar with my life might make the same call. On the other hand, Socrates is famously quoted as having said, "An unexamined life is not worth living." He was on trial for heresy and for encouraging his students to challenge the accepted beliefs of the time, to think for themselves. As you read this account, you'll understand why I agree with Socrates. But the real motivation behind this book is Jesus' statement, "Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." As I metaphorically lay my life bare for you in the pages of this book, I pray that it will be a blessing to you in some way. And since we always hurt the ones we love the most, I apologize in advance to those featured in this account in ways they might not prefer. It causes me pain to know that in writing this account, I will offend some. I ask forgiveness as I seek imperfectly to fulfill a higher calling. This book contains obscure biblical and theological references essential to the story, which may be puzzling to those unfamiliar with Herbert Armstrong and the Worldwide Church of God. This may detract from the text the way obscure 19th century whaling and zoology information detracts from Moby Dick. Some reviewers praise the recap of key doctrines and my struggle with their accuracy. If you don't, I guess you had to be there. Finally, your life is unique. You are a treasure to God, who I believe owns the secret place deep within your heart that is his abode. I realize that I'm on one extreme of the Worldwide Church of God experience spectrum, viewing my time in the Worldwide Church of God as overwhelmingly positive, knowing God guided my steps and used even painful experiences to bring me closer to him. Some with similar experiences disagree almost violently. I can only hope and pray that laying down my life may in some way be helpful to you as you continue, dear reader, along your own path, independently investigating truth. I'll end this open preface with two quotes. The first is an anonymous quote that recently caught my attention. The only thing I can change is myself, but sometimes that makes all the difference. My editor provided the second. The function of music is to release us from the tyranny of conscious thought. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how I've approached my own self-therapy through my writing and the journey of truth seeking and discovering what works and what doesn't and making peace. But back to my sister and this rivalry and the fact that once a year, she was 2 years older than me on her birthday, June 1st. And this bugged me as a kid, irritated me. Why couldn't I have been born on June 1st, I thought. Then at least one day a year, I would be the same age. And I could be her equal. And I could tell her, you're not my mom, shut up. The tip of the iceberg of my loss of my sister hit me like a knife through the heart when I realized on June 1st, which is coming up very fast, I will at last be the same age as my sister because she's gone. And I didn't get to spend anywhere near as much time with her as I would have wanted. And all the things that bugged me about her back then, and perhaps remnants of which remain throughout our lives, were really a result of who and what she was and her processing of these events. The reason I had to write the autobiographical record in the way that I did was because anybody else, like those newspapers, were going to try to tell the story their way, put their spin on it. I won't go so far as to say this is my truth. I don't like that term, my truth. This isn't my truth. It's my perspective on the greater truth. And we need to really deeply understand other people's perspectives. Now that my sister is gone, I suddenly feel like I have a glimpse into her perspective. The minute she left and I realized that this silly little rivalry I had as a boy, as a child, because of the suffering that I was experiencing, was the very thing that made her so valuable. If I can say one thing about my sister, I now recognize fully she was the glue that was missing and inadequate to hold our family together. This fractured, chaotic group of squabbling siblings that was thrust into the world far too early, far too young, not ready for what would come upon them because of the failures of my parents. And this international court battle. The things that bugged me were the things that she was trying to do to bring us back together, to hold it together, to keep it from falling apart. And she probably lived with the guilt of having run away at age 13 because of her inability to do so. But throughout her life, she was loved by all of her friends. She had an exemplary family of her own because of her love and her desire to bring people together. And it took losing her for me to recognize that. So I wanted to dedicate this opening segment of the show to her honor, Kobina Laomi Franson, a name so unusual because her father made it up. He thought it sounded nice. But but she was affectionately known as Kobe. We're going to go to a quick commercial break here for another author who we wish to honor, who passed away a year ago tomorrow, an author of 30 books who we're helping to promote, one in particular that is very suitable to this opening segment. So as soon as we finish this video, we'll go on with the regular show. We'll invite Cameron into the studio and we'll talk about Vinegar and Honey. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
History. Mankind has pondered the mysteries of life and what lies beyond. From the sands of ancient civilizations to the bustling streets of the modern world, religions have offered insights into the journey of the soul. Now, in the 21st century, acclaimed author Khushidhar Motla leaves behind a profound legacy with his work, Death, the Door to Heaven. This groundbreaking exploration of the afterlife from the perspective of the Baha'i faith carries on his wisdom and insights. Drawing from his deep understanding of the Baha'i faith, Motla offers new perspectives on the soul's journey through this world and into the next. With profound insight and clarity, Motla reveals the remedy for the spiritual challenges plaguing humanity in our time. Join the journey of discovery. Death, the Door to Heaven carries on the legacy of Khushidhar Motla. If you want to order a copy, email us at orders@soupllc.com.
So a quick plug for that book, which I have a copy right here. This book is wonderful, not only because it does bring in those inputs from the Baha'i writings, but Hugh, as he was known, Khushidhar Motla, and I would consider him a friend of mine. I'd met him really only once, but talked to him many times on the phone in his last years of his life. And he brings in the holy writings from all over: the Bible, the Old and New Testament, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, Buddhism, Hinduism, secular quotes, exploring the issue of death and what we call heaven from all those different perspectives. An amazing and wonderful book. With that, let's welcome Cameron into the studio. Welcome, Cameron.
Hello, hello. Well, that's a tough act to follow.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. I'll take that as a compliment to my sister. She is, in fact, a tough act to follow.
And in her passing, she also is a tough act for me to follow. So she's already living up to her reputation.
Well, and I really appreciate the generous comments that were in the chat, and please keep them coming. So, Cameron, the original idea that I had for this show was reward and punishment. And yes, you suggested Vinegar and Honey, which I loved. So let's start right there. We talked about this a little bit in the sneak peek. We'll unpack it a little bit more. What is the difference between Vinegar and Honey and reward and punishment?
Well, I'm going to try to center this camera. You know how there's an old saying, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. And I don't know, I was just kind of in the moment when I was filling in the form for the title of the show and everything. It just occurred to me that this was a kind of a similar situation sort of thing. But
of course, I and I mentioned that I always think of carrot and a stick when I think of reward and punishment. And you shared the difference then between vinegar and honey, which I thought was quite insightful, and the carrot and the stick.
Well, that's better. I think carrot and stick has, there's an element of coercion. There's an element of, if you don't chase that and follow that and eat that, then, then you're going to, then the stick comes out sort of thing. I think, whereas like with honey and vinegar, it's a matter of, there's a choice, there's an attraction, it's a different dynamic. You know, you have to choose, and you have to kind of decide what works best for you. Now, there are some things that will go for vinegar, natural microbes and other things, or even, you know, deer who like things very salty, you know, might go for vinegar, but other things will go for honey. Some people just like to suffer, you know, so they're going to sit in the corner and drink vinegar. We call it 2 buck chuck, but they'll sit in the corner and drink vinegar all night long. So it really, but there's a choice, and there's a choosing, and there's, you know, what energy do you want to play into? And so that's why I thought it was rather apt.
Well, there's a quote which I want to find. It's from the Baha'i Faith, and somebody who's maybe listening in from the Baha'i Clearwater channel might find it. But where Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, says something, and I apologize for mangling it, something to the effect of, you know, God has ordained reward and punishment of the twin pillars of civilization. That's one quote. And then another similar quote, which may or may not include that same allusion of them being the twin pillars of civilization, or upon these two pillars all civilization is built. But also that these two are life itself, that they're not only the twin pillars of civilization, but they are the very source of life. In other words, it's woven into the DNA of creation. And when you think about evolution and so-called survival of the fittest and other ways in which we've looked at evolution, and the betterment of a species, the achievement of any goal, you might say, you know, the vinegar and honey analogy, moving towards the light and moving away from darkness. And that the light, you know, helps us see how to improve. And the darkness, you know, may give us some solace at times, cover up some of the things we don't want to see. But dwelling in darkness is not a good recipe for success. So,
well, and that's an image that we see, you know, stretching back to antiquity with Plato's cave. I know you're not a huge fan of Plato.
Oh, I am a fan of Plato. I don't know why you would say that, but I am a fan of Plato, actually.
With the cave and leading people into the light. I think also the other kind of image from antiquity that I love with this is Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, which as an origin story I much prefer to the Judeo-Christian Adam and Eve story. Mostly because within Prometheus, not only do we have the enlightenment of man, but we also kind of have the fall of Lucifer kind of folded into one image, which I think is very interesting. And also it gives you a great insight into the Greek view of the world, which I think is very different from what we have now after 2,000 years of Christianity. So these images are very helpful, and let's also face the fact, you know, with it, when you leave Plato's cave and you go into the light, there's freedom and there's levity, but there's also danger. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, mankind gets enlightened, but there's implications to that too. Whatever you do, there will be, to borrow the parlance, rewards and consequences. It's just really a matter of whether you can put up with them or not. And some choices are better or not than others, and sometimes you go into it knowing what you're getting yourself into, and sometimes you don't. And that's just kind of, you know, how life on this planet works, for better or for worse. Yeah.
So in general, you're in basic agreement with the idea that reward and punishment in one form or another, whether it's the carrot and stick, the vinegar and honey, or many other analogies that one could use to describe this, that these are a driving force over time for individual and perhaps societal betterment?
Oh, I wouldn't always say betterment. I just think that's how humans, you know, work and organize themselves on this planet. In the 50s and 60s, they did one of the things they wanted to study and couldn't really ever find an ethical way to do it was feral children. They found, I think, one kid who'd lost his family and tribe in the jungles of Indonesia, and they studied him intensely to figure out how much of humanity was innate and how much of it was learned. As it turns out, a great deal of it is learned and very little of it is innate, but that was only one case, sort of thing.
And who knows the reason for their particular
Yeah.
hypotheses and their particular conclusions, which may or may not have been a full and accurate exploration of
Yeah,
reality.
if you want to go, yes, and if you want to go read about that, just Google feral children. There's books been written about this problem and that study, and it's a whole thing.
Sure,
It's a
of
whole
course.
rabbit hole. We're not going to go there
Right.
right now. But if someone wants to go, indulge
Yeah.
yourself. And um, and so there's, I mean, I think a lot of it is taught, but the thing is, it happens at a very young age when we're very unconscious of it. Most of our development in terms of who we are as people happens between 0 and 7. We now know from neuroscience. So how you raise your small children matters a whole awful lot. After age 7, it becomes what I like to call human management.
Okay, well
in all of my
let's stop there, because I want to try to do this as we go through and unpack some of the ideas one at a time. So if we accept what you just said, which I do, then that age 0 to 7 being critically important and all, and neuroscience and whatnot, and super learning and yada yada. The question still remains on various child rearing techniques, because there was this, speaking of the Worldwide Church of God in my autobiography, there was this famous book written by this famous evangelist in that church called The Plain Truth About Child Rearing, in which a behavioralist approach was taken and sort of married and coupled with certain ideas cribbed from the Bible, sometimes out of context, to create a specific child rearing approach. And I talk about this in my book and how it was wielded by my father and others in the Worldwide Church of God. And psychologists would say much carnage ensued as a result of that. And in my case, well, my father came into the church when I was already 10 or 11, and I didn't start being managed by those techniques until I was already 13. But I did meet others in the church who had been raised from infancy with those techniques. So the reason I'm diving into this piece of it is there are various theories about how a parent might apply this idea of reward and punishment, or not apply the idea of reward and punishment during that crucial stage. So if we accept the premise which you laid out, that much of it is done within the first 7+ years, based on whatever environment that child is nurtured in, taught in, and whatnot, then the question is, well, what would be an ideal approach? And I've never heard you talk about kids, so I don't assume you have them. I do have a couple of them, but let's go down this path anyway.
No, I don't have children of my own, but I unfortunately, fortunately, depending on your perspective, have spent inordinate parts of my life taking care of other people's children. I helped raise my cousins through 12 to 18 into early 20s. My seamstress, Brady, I was the big part of her son's life when we were in business together. And I was a nanny for a long time. And I've seen very many different types of parenting and different approaches people have taken and all this type of thing. I grew up evangelical, and my mother is a force to be reckoned with. So I was raised in a very strict sort of way where rewards and consequences were swift and sure. And my mother is as consistent as the rising and setting sun, so it was never a mystery what was going to happen, how it was all going to go down. I also grew
Was
up
that ultimately
basic life principles thing.
Was that ultimately helpful to you to have that certainty, or would you have preferred then, and perhaps even in hindsight, a lot more uncertainty and therefore flexibility?
I think as a young person, it was good. I think having a certain amount of structure, especially below age 12, is very important. Having consistent routines, bedtimes, eating times, chores, household management, those lay foundational skills you'll use for the rest of your life. I would have liked a little bit more levity in high school because I was very responsible. I mean, I was working at the state senate when I was 17 and was great, and everyone loved me and all this type of thing. And so as I got older, I found the conundrum I found myself in was I had all the responsibility, but none of the power to change it, modify it, make it work for me, all this type of thing. So I was kind of stuck in this structure that wasn't working, was very frustrating, had a laundry list of obligations, no power to do anything
Too much
about
carrot
it.
and stick, not enough vinegar and honey, perhaps.
Yeah, the vinegar and honey were out. All we had in stock that day were carrots and sticks, and so, yeah, I mean, it was very difficult. My mom, when I first started to drive, my mom used to follow me around because she was convinced I was going to go somewhere and do something crazy and all this sort of thing. And as I was saying, I was also raised with the whole basic life principles Goddard Institute thing. So I was at the little conferences with the sashes and, holding our arms up like this and all this sort of thing, which if you watch that documentary, Shiny Happy People, they go a lot into basic life principles and all that whole thing that is over there, which is one of the reasons I haven't watched it. I'm still traumatized. And so, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, that, which is also homeschooling and all this sort of thing, it has allowed me to live an absolutely crazy bonkers life and do things way younger than I ever would have done. It's given me, as someone who is self-employed and works for myself and all this type of thing, it gave me the discipline to know when to get up, how to fulfill a contract, how to make sure that I've given every person they need, to make sure I, get to every meeting and be on time. Because for my mother, on time is late. She's 15 minutes early. She was sitting in the parking lot. And so I mean, all of that has been tremendous in my life. However, I'm with someone right now who wasn't raised like that at all. And she is much more of a free spirit. She's more open to wants and needs and desires. She's much more in touch with herself than I probably ever will hope to be. And so she'll get up and say, I want X, Y, and Z, don't you? And I'm kind of like, well, kind of, but I repressed it, sort of thing. And she is, is not that way at all. And so I also see where there's some deficits in terms of how you live your life and things that you do and do not do and all this type of thing. I'm old enough now to say, I'm turning 36 in 10 days. I'm old enough now to say it's both and. There were some great parts of it that have helped me. There were some not so great parts.
Well, and I think I'm looking for the right way to bridge this from the very personal, individual, singular experience. I'm reminded of having had Jason Persoff on the show earlier, talking about COVID and people's experiences and his scientific perspective that your individual experience is completely meaningless. And only when we, look at a large set of people and get the aggregate data over time, can we understand the truth, because you, as a one individual, have no clue based on your personal experience. I found that entertaining, amusing, had a truthiness to it, but also completely wrong. In one sense.
Well, it's one of those situations that I can, if something terrible has happened to you, and I can say, well, on the bright side, this only happens to 18% of people on the planet, which is a comparatively small number. That's great to hear. But if you're the one who's got this bad thing happening to you, for you, it's 100%.
Right.
Like for you, the stats don't matter. It's 100%. And that, and that is a different, sort of, dynamic. But when you talk about society, before we started, we were talking about how this plays out in society with things like social policy.
Well, exactly. And that's where we're going to go next.
Yeah.
Is that
I'm giving you a bridge. I'm building a bridge, Wade, and now we're on to societal social policy. See what I did there?
That was amazing, and thank you for being an enabler there. But before we do, we're going to actually play a little clip from your book, because we want to continue to encourage audience participation, more broadly.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of people making comments, so lots of them, which is great. Would like to encourage some others. So you'll have and there's a tornado warning going off here in the background. And I don't know if you guys can hear that. I can hear it coming through our phones. We have a tornado warning going on here in my home studio. Anyway, assuming that we don't get hit by a tornado, tomatoes may be coming this way too. We will play this clip, Cameron, of your book about how to make sense of all this madness. And when we come back, we'll talk about the societal impact of rewards and punishment and get into perhaps some specific examples and dive deeper into this. So don't go anywhere. We will be back with more of Vinegar and Honey with Cameron Cowan right after this little video about his book.
Feel overwhelmed by the confusion and chaos of today's world? Politics, the media, and even the environment have become increasingly challenging landscapes to navigate. We're living in a narrative that began 4 decades ago, and now we're reaching its climax. What the Hell is Going On is here to provide clarity and perspective. Don't get triggered by another tweet or misled by clickbait ads. Gain a deeper understanding and grasp the broader picture. Understanding is powerful. When we comprehend the news in context, we can see through the sensationalism and misinformation. Get insight and clarity by discovering what the hell is going on post-COVID. Cowan's insightful and well-researched work will help you navigate the complexities of today's world. Order your copy today.
Well, Cameron, tell us just very briefly before we talk about the impact of Vinegar and Honey on society, about that book that we just saw a clip from, and about the pre and post COVID versions of it.
Yeah, so What the Hell is Going On was an essay collection I put together that was kind of the best of the Cameron Journal, CameronJournal.com, from 2014 to 2019, and it came out in 2019. It was the first book I ever published. I learned layout and cover design and all this sort of thing on that book. So the first edition, while somewhat popular, it was imperfect. And so the post-COVID version does 2 things. One, a lot of the problems have been cleaned up, which is great. And the other thing is it has a whole bunch of new essays, including new essays on the Black Lives Matter movement, domestic terrorism, woke culture, how America is changing, cybersecurity, and a signature essay I wrote with the Military Religious Freedom Foundation about Christian nationalism, which is a must-read for all people. So there's a lot of great new material. The old material has been fixed up. The new cover is really lovely. And it was designed by my friend Jenna Thomas, who has done my next couple covers. And it's really great. It'll be coming out in the fall.
Wonderful. So if somebody wins a copy, they'll get the pre-COVID version right now?
Yes, or they'll have to be very, very patient. But otherwise, yes, right now you get the pre-COVID version. So
wonderful.
Which I don't even know if we have any of those in stock, but we'll figure it out. We'll sort it.
They will get a copy, even though, as we've told Taz, you may have to email twice, but email info@soupllc.com for that book. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about how reward and punishment certainly, is a motivator, a shaper, hopefully mostly for the positive, depending on how it's implemented, right? And we didn't have time to really get into the pros and cons and, of which types of it, other than just these 2 brief analogies, carrot and stick and vinegar and honey. But really, how does one implement reward and punishment on a societal level? If we take for granted, which I do, this quote that I mentioned from Baha'u'llah, that reward and punishment, twin pillars of civilization, and life itself, and my own analysis of reality and the way the world works, and it is a good thing to be intrinsically motivated, but at the same time, the paths that we have to walk on and drive on, and the behaviors that are necessary to survive are all shaped by these ideas of reward and punishment, whether it's vinegar and honey or whatever. But once we get systems of systems, right, complex systems of systems, in which decisions, laws, rules, regulations have society-wide impact, that's when unintended consequences can begin to point out this sometimes very serious flaws of any systematic effort to deploy a reward and punishment framework. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think the incentives for that sort of thing come in a variety of ways. And different societies do it differently. In East Asian societies, social shame is a very important thing. We haven't done a book trailer for it yet, but my other nonfiction book, America's Lost Generation, is coming out this fall. And it analyzes millennials and our plight through the eyes of our Japanese cousins who did it 15 years before us. And one of the things I learned about Japanese society in my extensive research was how much they rely on social shame, I can talk, to really reinforce their social norms. And that's true across Japan, China, but to a lesser and different degree. Korea, very much so.
Let's talk about Japan for a moment. Social shame versus what, for example? Contrasted with what, for example?
Yeah, so social shame as opposed to the Anglosphere, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, where we use law, the legal system, and a lot of slack in our societies in order to, kind of regulate behavior. I think the most comparable thing that's kind of a merger of the two is Germany, which kind of has a little bit of both, a strong legal system and social shame kind of working together in order to have, a certain society and a certain way of being. And
I'm smiling because I lived in Germany for almost 10 years. And I kind of thumbed my nose from time to time at a little bit of the social shame. much to the consternation of those around me.
Yes, I mean it is. I mean there is kind of these different ideas and systems. So we reward and incentivize behavior through a variety of ways. When we had the drug war, we tried to really disincentivize that by having high sentences. You used to be able to go to jail for 25 years for a nonviolent marijuana offense, and in many ways.
My sister, my little sister, who won't let me use her name in my work, which I honor, is a felon for that reason, and that goes around with her and has caused her no end of harm and heartache.
One of the best writers I know, a guy named Drew Mason, who lives in the mountains of Appalachia above Tennessee near Dollywood, is very much in the same boat. Fortunately, unfortunately. And it's, unfortunately, the way we've structured our society is those people, we really kind of, leave you behind with all this stuff that even once you've served your time and quote unquote paid your debt to society, it kind of becomes a scarlet letter for the rest of your life. But that's an example of how America we put you in a bucket, and once you're in that bucket, it's very, very hard to get out of it. And we do this, socially with the criminal justice system. We do it through race. The British do it through class. We do that kind of through class, but with enough money, you can be anything in this country. But in Britain, the class system has been in place for 1,000 years, and whatever class you're born into, that's where you're at.
Well, but surely the British system
marriage into the aristocracy or royalty.
Surely the British system hardly compares to the caste system of India.
Well, you took that was the next. I was going to go back to. We were kind of in the English here for a second. I was going to go back to age and say yes. When you look at the caste system in India, that's the same thing but worse, and it has religious overtones because it's how you're responsible for things you did in your past life, because you're on the never-ending wheel of fortune. So, as humans on this planet, we have discovered the things in different cultures that we do and do not want people to do, and we have. And you can see this with school children, created rules and institutions to kind of elevate that which we want people to do and repress that which we don't want people to do.
How is that?
And
watch
any group of small children play amongst themselves, and you'll see this dynamic.
But how is that different from social shame? And again, getting back to the feral child kind of approach, is that more inherent behavior, or is that really inculcated into those children?
I mean, I think a lot of it is taught, especially by example. Um, Especially, I mean, and depending on the society and culture you grew up in, the social shame is an enforcement mechanism. And that's really when we talk about these incentives, disincentives, the carrot and the stick, the vinegar and the honey, which one we want people to go towards and want people to avoid. Really depends on how it's enforced. So in Japan, your advancement in society and your ability to get a job and survive is really dependent on your personal connections, usually coming out of school. So whatever cohort you're in, you better like them because you're stuck with them for life. And if you know, want to move, want to make a change, whatever have you, it's that personal network, that network of trust that's going to help you. That's not as much so in the Anglosphere where meritocracy is more of a thing. And it's like, what degrees do you have? What qualifications do you have? In this country, a lot of your success is on something as banal as skin color. In Europe, it's class. Different cultures have done these things a different way to decide who gets to do what, who's going to do what, and what incentives or disincentives are going to engage within the society.
Do you have an evaluation of these different? So if we look at the world, its nations, its cultures, as a set of petri dishes, right? Each one with their own unique culture. If we grant that we are all really one, right? We are all human beings. There's one species, and the whatever fraction of DNA that delivers a different color, right? Is so meaningless that there's really no difference between any of us. Then all of these little petri dishes are all seeking to do the same thing, which is to create the best culture for this species, right? And let's even throw religion into it and say holistically the best culture for the souls of these species. In other words, not just this experience, not this circle around on the merry-go-round, but for our eternal life. Do you have any opinion on which of any of these petri dishes are more effective at delivering that than others? And this isn't a judgment of the people, other than to say, well, these people seem to have figured it out a little better than these other people.
I mean, that's all a matter of perspective and where you come from and what you want.
Well, there you go. What
if
you want, right?
a highly, yes, if you want, well, if you want a highly clean, ordered society with, you know, high levels of social trust, we might look to Singapore or to Japan. If you want a dynamic, innovative society that will put a man on the moon, the United States is your bet. If you would like a clean, orderly society with lots of industrial capacity and the ability to kind of do things in lockstep, you might call Germany. If you want to conquer the whole planet, you might want to call the British, the Dutch, or the French, or the Spanish, or some combination of all four.
Which leads me to one of my favorite jokes, having lived in Germany and Switzerland. You know what the difference is between the Germans and the Swiss? The Germans will give a millimeter. Because the Swiss, you know, if the German trains run on time, you know, well, the Swiss trains, you know, you could set the atomic clock by them. And
no, I mean, they're and people, I mean, and let's not.
And I loved it. I loved it in Germany and Switzerland for a while, and then after a while, I could no longer take it.
Yeah, well, and let's face it, when it comes to having a functional society where people are able to live their lives, buy food, have children that survive, all this type of thing requires a certain amount of that. And there are some societies where they don't have much of it, and I would say their societies do not function as well, but that's my American perspective. Their perspective would be rather different. Um, and I think one of the kind of great crimes we do is we keep ascribing our European Anglosphere perspective on the whole planet. That doesn't
well,
work.
having
You
lived
know,
in 7 different countries, I can absolutely speak to that as to how these different countries view each other. And everyone thinks
right.
that they have it all figured out and that their system is the best.
Of
Except
course.
maybe America in the modern era. In the last 10 years, America seems to be the most self-loathing country these days, in which we're convinced we've got it so completely screwed up beyond repair that we have to dismantle our entire society and commit Harry to bring in a different societal concept into ours.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, I agree. We're definitely, Jimmy Carter's malaise seems to have reared its ugly head um, in the last several years. I remember I was editing a podcast episode called "The Presidents" in season 2 of the Cameron Journal podcast, and I went through all the presidents from Washington to. I think when I was doing it, we still had Trump in, from Washington to Trump and everybody in between, and I did a whole bunch of kind of different presidential speeches and all this type of thing, and so I had to watch several clips of Jimmy Carter's malaise speech to find the clip I was looking for. And I called my mom and I said, did he really get on national television, complain things were bad, and then offer no solutions? And she's like, yes, and that's why he lost in 80. And I'm like, I can see it. I totally get it now. Like, screw the Iran revolution. He would have lost my vote on that basis alone. Like, but sir, you're the president. Like, so, no, I mean, but I think it's because in America we have this bad habit of thinking it's always better somewhere else. And I think that's because we had this attitude of westward expansion. If you don't like it here, go somewhere else. Well, we've gone from coast to coast. Canada's not letting us move in. Mexico doesn't want us either. So we're kind of finally stuck in this geographic area, and we can't just go somewhere else and do something else or start something different. We actually have to live here with the people that are here and actually address the problems and issues. Now, I tend to agree with you. I think we're getting we could use an SSRI. I think Zoloft for the country might be a good idea. But for the first time in almost 250 years, we're actually going to have to fix things around here rather than just move somewhere else. And so I think we like to look to Europe for its social programs, especially tells us that love of universal health care and better welfare. Oh, yes, the Scandinavian countries, that's the system. And other people who want a clean, orderly, regulated society, they will look to East Asia and say, oh, why can't we have Japan or Singapore, or Vietnam or Malaysia. And so there's, I think, this natural tension of how now shall we live? A very great book, by the way. But and trying to figure out kind of what the path forward is for the United States in the 21st century. And I think, I think it's competing desires. We want the dynamic, innovative, you can start in a garage and create the Disney company. You can start in an office and create Amazon, all this type of thing. We want to keep that, but we also want the trains to run on time. We also want the subways to be clean. We want public transportation. We want, a solid social safety net. Maybe some of us do, some people don't, all this sort of thing. And so I think right now we're having this great debate of what we're doing isn't working for a lot of people. What's next?
I'd like to,
and unfortunately, rather than looking for the answer, we're looking out to the rest of the world to tell us what to do, and it's not going to work.
I'd like to throw an opinion out there, bringing it back to sort of this idea of reward and punishment. First of all, you mentioned Scandinavia, having lived in Sweden and thought about this a lot most of my life. The thing about Sweden and its version of socialism, if you will, and its version of the orderly society that takes care of everybody and has reduced significantly income inequality, and brought the poor up, and without completely having to destroy the rich, although by other standards certainly there are less opportunities to become fabulously wealthy in Sweden, and nonetheless one of the richest people in the world was Swedish. Cameron, the founder of IKEA. Anyway,
Yeah.
my point being that, well, the thing about Sweden was it was completely
And great cars too. Too bad we don't have Saab anymore.
right.
Great
It
cars.
was virtually homogenous, right? I mean, there's one,
Right.
the overwhelming identity, completely and utterly unlike the American experiment, which was the massive melting pot of peoples from all over the world, whether they came here voluntarily, were conquered, or dragged here in ships against their will to, to slavery. We nonetheless had, the most unbelievably diverse population in the history of the world.
Because the whole world is here.
Right, completely,
which is very unique.
Completely the opposite of Sweden, and so very difficult to compare those two experiences on the one hand. On the other hand, to your point about putting man on the moon, the experiment of America produced such unimaginable wealth. And again, the narrative about how we raped and pillaged a virgin continent plays into that consumption and creation of wealth. But nonetheless, undeniably, we created the most fabulously wealthy people, where almost every single citizen lived like a king compared to, any other society in the history of Earth. And at least, as Billy Joel said famously in, I forget the title of his song, but every kid had a pretty good shot to get at least as far as his old man got, right? About Allentown, I think it was the song, about how back in the 50s and 60s, there was this belief that everybody could become wealthy in America. And this drove materialism unlike ever experienced before. My point being that although we had greed, insatiable greed and envy, of those who had it better, the keeping up with the Joneses kind of effect, nonetheless, the gross impact of reward and punishment was largely removed, to the point where the opioid crisis, was spurred on by the fact that we were trying to remove every kind of suffering, every kind of pain had to be completely removed. All you had to do was go into a doctor's office, point to a little chart, and say, yes, my pain is a 6 on a scale of 0 to 10, whether it was or wasn't, your real pain, your psychic pain, whatever it was, and you would literally be given an opioid to ease your pain. So in that sense, this malaise that we experience, or this self-loathing, or this lack of satisfaction, of happiness, of contentment, on the one hand might be laid at the feet of having eradicated reward and punishment in to a large degree. And I'm not just speaking of America now, but I'm speaking of the entirety of Western civilization.
Yes, I mean, I can see that. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who would rather live in a society as we once did in this country, focused on mass affluence, and we had the tax policy and the regulations to make that possible, and we dumped it so a handful of people could get stupidly wealthy. But I also would say, I mean, I think that can be an outgrowth of that, but certainly our society today is a lot harsher than it used to be. I remember years ago, I don't remember if I wrote it or I said it, but I expressed it by some means, where I said, I think one of the really odd things about America today is if you make a mistake and if something goes wrong, recovery is a lot harder. Like,
let me give one. Let me give one.
Have like 3 divorces. I'm like, how did you afford 3 divorces? I don't understand. But it was a different time, a different situation. You could bounce back. Nowadays, you make a career mistake, that can be fatal. Marry the wrong person, devastating.
Well,
I mean,
here's a great example.
The ability to kind of come back from life's mistakes is a lot less than it used to be.
One great example of that today, if your car is worth $10,000 and you have a fender bender that messes up some of the sensors or equipment or this, your car will be totaled and not allowed to drive on the road.
Yes, I've been there, done
Even
that.
though it is
Yes.
completely and utterly functional. And you know, a few
Yes.
decades ago, every car on the road was less safe than that car. You follow me? And so the point
Right.
is that the standards.
But my mother would argue she would rather deal with the less safe car, but a car that will survive, than cars that make it safer for the people, but a small fender bender totals them, would be her argument. Her and I have talked about this. That would be her argument.
That's kind of my point. The standards keep getting raised such that you have to run that much faster to keep up. And
Yes.
the standard of what is acceptable, for example, what would be allowed on the road, is so completely and utterly
Right.
different. So,
oh, now we have airbags, seat belts, crumple zones, blind spot. I mean, I drive a 2017 Subaru. My car before that was a 2001 Audi A6 that I loved called Madam. I called my dad like the third day I owned it. I said, I need the entire crew of the Starship Enterprise to drive this car. It has more buttons and screens and does. I still don't know what some of those buttons do, and I've had the car 6 years. It's out of control. It's just so much. But on the bright side, one would argue a backup camera, which is now mandatory, is way safer. You don't run over. I mean, all of these things. And my mom would say, well, my 63 Ford Fairlane that I had when I graduated high school was just fine, thank you. And I don't need all although she loves her backup camera now. But she would still argue her Ford Fairlane was just fine.
well, but
it got her through 2 years of high school and to work.
But you get my point, Cameron, in terms of unpacking how and why it is that one mistake today sets you back. Again, you know, the mistake of what college you go to. People are graduating with $200,000 in college debt. Of course, we'll just forgive all that debt, but that all then gets transferred to the taxpayers, who have a harder time than being able to put away any money. Meanwhile, the universities, who arguably are the cause of it all, are completely exonerated from having created worthless degrees that cost $200,000. Worthless in the sense that they don't allow the person to ever get a job that could possibly pay back the debt. Again, the reward and punishment aspect of that has been completely severed. The cause and effect of who created that debt and why, and from whose pocket did the money go into, and is that person expected to pay back the money for this useless degree that put somebody $200,000 in debt? You follow me? So this complicated system of systems has removed the causality of reward and punishment, is I guess what I'm saying.
I mean, I think it is in microcosm situations, that is certainly true. I mean, the student loan debate, which we've had before, there's aspects of it where, people are the way that debt is handled and managed could be changed to make it more achievable for most people. But yes, I mean, as someone with 3, what some people would say, useless degrees, I would say, yes, that is definitely a factor. It is definitely a problem. And I would counter that by saying we could go back to really funding higher education in this country. We want people to be educated in order to, work in the jobs in the new economy. This is what I grew up with, all this type of thing. However, we moved the responsibility of funding the education from that off of society as a collective, and we moved it onto the individual, which caused that problem to begin with. Now, under which system would we come out money ahead?
Well, I think
privatized all the problem, or the one where we fund higher ed? I haven't done the study, so I won't claim which one of those is right. But but this is how we change social policy.
I think to
create a certain outcome.
I think you're ignoring this escalation effect, the car analogy that I used, that the car's totaled after, So I hit a deer with my very new car, and I was shocked at the price tag of this little, basically a fender bender, with this
Right.
deer. It wasn't a major hit. The deer basically jumped into my car from the side of the road. I didn't really hit the deer.
Right.
But this was a $10,000 insurance bill because of the nature of the newness of my car and the calibration of the camera, the safety mechanisms, and then the fact that I had paid for this special dent protection wrap around the paint of the car, and that was another $1,000. It's all this garbage. And my point being, the same with education, right? This $200,000 useless degree that the person can't ever pay it back. It doesn't really matter who has the debt. The fact is that this degree should never have been created or cost that much in that sense. It's the same sort of systemic aggregation of things. Let's take healthcare as another example. Not that I would want to be on the death panel that makes the individual decision about whether this octogenarian should really have both hips replaced at whatever
Right.
exorbitant cost, or heaven forbid, gender surgery that results in a lifetime regimen of expensive medications. And society is now supposed to pay for this, several $1 million of medical treatment. And then to say that, well, we went off the track when we stopped having society pay for these things, I don't think that's necessarily correct or accurate. Again, I would argue the opposite point, that by shoving it off on society, we're removing the direct cause and effect decisioning of the person choosing the honey versus the vinegar.
Well, yes, but we also have to remember that as a society, we encourage people through narrative, through news, through popular media, through the education system. Is what we want people to do. And there's, outcomes of that. In fact, we talk a lot about in public policy about unintended consequences, which are notorious anytime you have a new public policy. The most famous one is Argentina's bachelor tax. In the 1930s, they said there were too many single men around, so they decided to tax them, and the only way you could get out of the tax was if a woman had refused to marry you. So women, being entrepreneurial, set up little booths. I'll reject you, sign your paper, you get out of the tax. They didn't collect any more revenue, but they did create a great cottage industry for Argentinian women to reject men for the bachelor tax. So I mean, in that way, GDP grew. But so one of the struggles with public policy is you try to design a policy that has the most positive outcomes and the least negative outcomes. And sometimes we get that fabulously correct. The food stamp program is the most efficient, effective federal program. And not only does it help farmers and subsidize agriculture, but in terms of government waste and everything, it is the leanest, most efficient, most effective for reducing hunger program the federal government does.
Perhaps
that are not so efficient.
Yeah, perhaps save for the fact that
sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong.
Perhaps save for the fact that food stamps can be used for soft drinks and frozen pizzas.
And people with Mayor Bloomberg of New York who would argue, no, we shouldn't have that. Yes, I mean, all this sort of, yes, there are arguments out there for that. And I think, that's something in the conversation of public policy. That's a conversation worth having. But I'm strictly from
I agree with you. I'm not dissing.
It's an incredibly efficient
I'm not dissing the food stamp program with that statement. I guess I'm really contrasting that sort of social shame model that you talked about in certain Eastern countries, versus the American complete and total freedom. Well, if I want to use my food stamps to buy, sugar water and nutritionless, quick, fast food, I should be allowed to do so, just like any other American should be allowed to ruin their health.
And that's something where, I mean, yes, and in that way, I mean, how American, have we sort of designed that? If Germans were designing that program, they would already be out a little, and they would have an itemized list of exactly, to the item, of what you could and could not buy. And they would update it weekly. Teams of people would be spreading out the whole nation, deciding what exactly people could buy and how and all this type of thing. It would be very ordered, and there would be a program, there'd be committees, all this sort of thing.
It's true, which is why after 10 years in Germany, I couldn't wait to get back to the freedoms of America. But this really gets back to...
Whereas in America, we'll drop $400 on your EBT card and shove you out at the grocery store and say, have fun.
Well, but and to wrap this up, and especially for our religious folks, I do, the title of the show, Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. I mean, perhaps this is a good point to leave it on, is that the way that, in my view, the way that God created us, he put us in the garden, and he gave us sovereignty in that garden. He put the greater and lesser lights in heaven, the sun and the moon, to rule the day and to rule the night. But other than that framework, he said, you are in charge. He gave us commandments: dress and keep the garden, something we haven't necessarily done the best job at. The other commandment, be fruitful and multiply. That one we knocked out of the park, became the most invasive species the world has ever seen. A little bit less on the dress and keep the garden part, but we were given complete and total freedom to do whatever we want, to imagine whatever we want, to create whatever we want. We were given creative powers in the image of God. And this little petri dish called the planet, we were allowed to build whatever society we wanted. And we've done so all around the earth in hundreds, if not thousands, of cultures and subcultures.
Well, and let's not also, to your point, underestimate the effect that, because religion and culture are so uniquely tied, the effect of religion on cultures and how, what we incentivize, what we don't incentivize, what we want people to do, what we don't want them to do, what we consider good, what we consider evil. Especially when you get into smaller, more odd cultures like the Hmong people and different tribes who have really different ways of organizing their society and really different customs and all this type, and sometimes very different beliefs about the divine and all this sort of thing. You see that interplay, and that's what I think makes this conversation interesting. Is if you gathered 10 people from 10 diverse cultures and started testing on this stuff, you'd get very different answers. What is acceptable in Tokyo is not so in Berlin, but maybe in New York. And perhaps maybe not so in Singapore, but might be in Ho Chi Minh City or Jakarta. And so you end up with this great diversity of things and ideas, and that's where, being able to kind of pick what cultural religious regime you want to live under is a great luxury, but also being willing to change as the times change. We live in now it's so tough because technology moves so fast, society moves so fast forward. My childhood is the dark ages compared to what kids now have and deal with and are handling all this type of thing. It's almost irrelevant to them. And that wasn't true. Like my grandmother's childhood during the Depression and my mom's childhood, which took place in the same house, weren't that different. But the difference between my childhood and my mom's childhood and my childhood was a little bit different because we had computers. The difference between my childhood and my nephew of the heart, Oliver, we didn't have iPads. We didn't have so much stuff when I was his age, all this sort of thing. It's so different. The things are so different. I think that's one of the struggles we have with trying to figure out, how do we live? What are the incentives? What are those rewards? Because our society in the last 150 years has gone from agrarian to industrial to post-industrial in only a couple generations. So I think part of our struggle is these long wisdom traditions that took thousands of years to develop and all this type of thing just don't seem as relevant now. Or one would argue they're more relevant today than they ever have been.
I love that. I love that framing of covering all your bases, but it's so true.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to believe the great wisdom traditions are more important now than ever before, because I think the world needs that. Science is great, but it tells a lousy story.
You're a conservative?
And as someone... As someone who loves a good story, I think religion and spirituality provides that for a lot of people. And I think that's very important. And I think it's something that is, should be honored and respected and understood in society. I also understand those who say, yeah, that's kind of old fashioned and out of date and let's leave it behind, which when it comes to the Abrahamic religions, I tend to be a little bit more in that camp. But I mean, but there is that tension of, yeah, that's old and outdated, let's get rid of it. Or no, we need to double down because the world is a scary and crazy place. And so I kind of see both sides of it, but I think having some sort of spiritual story, practice, whatever have you, it is an anchor and it is a solace in a world that seems to have gone mad. And I can only imagine, in times of previous peril, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the fall of Rome, the turning of the year 1000, all these sorts of things that sometimes that's all that people had to get through. And, that's perhaps it's a lesson for our time as well.
Well, I love how you wrapped that up. I was sort of looking at the clock, realizing we were over and thinking that we need to bring this in for a landing. And I think you did so quite nicely. I will add just a plug for our Baha'i friends, me being one, of course, not to hide that fact, although I don't, wear it on my sleeve all the time. But the Clearwater Baha'i channel that airs this program as well, is that the premise there is that there are ongoing messengers that bring the specific modifications to that wisdom teaching, that shed new light on it, that present it from a different perspective, that give additional clarifying information for that rapidly changing society, just like a physician would, prepare a proper diagnosis of what aileth thee today and make sure that the right remedy is available. Because the pace of change and the impact of technology certainly has thrown us all for a loop. That anchor is important, in my opinion. I could not agree with you more, while also being open to new input and new ideas.
No, absolutely. And I think, we are, I think one of the great things about the 2020s and into the 2030s is I think we're kind of starting to hit a little bit of a plateau in tech. The chips can't get any smaller. Newtonian physics won't allow it. They fit as many transistors in those as they can. So we're really reaching the top end of what classical computing can do. And the future is quantum, but we're not there yet. The future is AI, but we're not there yet. Quantum and AI together will be like the inventing of the steam engine, but we're a while away from that yet. So I think we're going to have a little time to do some rest.
Well, and maybe we're not ready for it. Maybe we've raced ahead. We're out over our skis, and there needs to be a big reset.
Well, that gets into my own personal spiritual beliefs on some of this stuff, but yes, I would say that is definitely a factor as well.
We also didn't sort of address your perspective on individual collectivism, but we've talked about that in the past, and perhaps we will again.
If people want to go learn about individual collectivism, there's a whole show on this channel where we spend the whole hour on individual collectivism. Yeah. So I would invite people to go. I wasn't trying to make this a show about IC, so that people can go watch about that there, and I would welcome them to.
Yeah, I just thought it was worth mentioning because I love the integration that you've created there. So really, all we have left is to award free books, and as I've been looking through the comments, I've already decided and put in the chat my solution for what aileth me today, which is this solution, which I will share here. Email info@soupllc.com with your comment about tonight's show to win a copy of the book of your choice. It might be The People of the Sign by yours truly. It might be What the Hell is Going On by our guest Cameron Cowan. It might be Death, the Door to Heaven by Hushadar Motlach. Any one of those three or all of those three are eligible for multiple people. Email info@soupllc.com with your comments on tonight's show and win a copy of that book. So having dealt with that, all that remains is to talk about episode 95. Now, episode 95 next week is interesting because there's significance to the number 95. 95 prayers. I'll just say that and nothing more right now. 95 prayer beads. The number 95 has significance. So I was kind of interested when it so happened, without any planning, that we're going to be talking to Bert Lawrence. He's actually, his name is Norbert. He's German heritage. Bert rather. Bert, I say Bert because German, but Bert Lawrence, who has written a book called The True Location of Solomon's Temple. And it's called The Temple Solution. Could a new location for Solomon's Temple offer a narrow path of peace in the Middle East? I'm reminded of that Chariots of Fire movie, which I love, by the way, in which the Olympic Committee suggests a different day and a different race for Eric Liddell, thereby neatly solving his Sabbath problem and allowing him to compete in the Olympics, even though his race was scheduled on the Sabbath. And interestingly, could an alternative location for Solomon's Temple provide a narrow path for peace in the Middle East? We'll be talking to Bert, who has spent decades studying into this question and has written a very interesting book. We'll be expanding out beyond just the specifics of his theory and the location into general topics of great importance as the world turns today. Many of you probably following world events know what's been going on. Those references to Jimmy Carter, we're at another pivotal moment in time, perhaps more so than we think. Perhaps we've been lulled into a sense of security, and Bert's book might be one way to look at this problem in a unique way. So same place, same time, 8 p.m. Central. Don't miss episode 95 next week. Cameron, thank you for being here with us tonight. Any last words, or have you already wrapped it up nicely?
No, I wrapped it up nightly, but if people want to keep up with me, at Cameron Cowan, pretty much everywhere except TikTok, which is at Cameron Journal. And if you don't want to remember all that, just over to CameronJournal.com. All the links are there. Lots to read, lots to listen to. And thank you so much for having me on.
It's been my pleasure. Always enjoyable. I love both the overlap and the diversity in our viewpoints and opinions. And hopefully it's made for some compelling and entertaining show tonight. So,
it always does.
Until next week, everyone, may God be with you. And I look forward to seeing you here. Same place, same